Good evening. My name is Paula Kempfer, and I am a survivor of clergy sexual abuse as an adult. And I work with survivors for the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis. We warmly welcome you this evening. These topics can be sensitive and cause triggering for some. We ask that you do whatever it takes to make yourself feel comfortable and safe. Our intent is never to cause more harm. There will be time for questions and answers, and please put them in the Q&A box on your screen. I'd like to introduce you to our presenter. Dr. Marie Griffith is the John C. Danforth Distinguished Professor in the Humanities at Washington University in St. Louis, and served 12 years as director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. She previously served as a professor of religion at Princeton and later as a professor of New England church history at Harvard Divinity School. She is the author of several books. Her current project analyzes the sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church and various Protestant denominations, as well as independent churches. We welcome and thank you for being with us, Marie.
Thank you so much, Paula, and thanks to all of you for being here. I am going to share my screen, but just want to say just what an honor it is for me to get to have the chance to speak with all of you. I'm like many people, I want to be an amplifier of this great movement of survivors. With my own small but sturdy platform as a scholar of religion and politics. So please hear me as that. I'm not a journalist. I respect what journalists do greatly. They break the stories. They do in-depth coverage of the stories. The scholarly trajectory is sort of the longer, slower trajectory that can maybe dig more deeply and bring in the history, but we don't get to break the stories, but we still ask complicated questions that demand time and effort to answer. I am much more interested in hearing your questions for those of you who are watching live here tonight. So Paula asked me to speak for about an hour. I'll probably talk a little less than that, but leave plenty of time at the end for your questions, if you'll please put them in the Q&A box. And as Paula said, if anything that I say is triggering at all, please know that is not my intent. I'm sorry, and please take care of yourself. I don't want to be re-traumatizing anyone. So, okay, as you see, this first slide shows a range of survivors of clergy sexual abuse, all of whom have chosen to go public with their work toward church accountability and reform. And I expect some of their faces will be familiar to those of you here. The photo on the left presents a group of Catholic survivors from the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. The center photo features a survivor and her mother. The mother fought hard for justice for her daughter, and they were recently featured in a major story that the AP published, I think in December, that got wide national coverage. And I encourage you to look at that, Gloria Webster and Angelique. And then the photo on the right shows survivors of abuse by Southern Baptist clergy who are fighting a fight that feels like it's about 20 years or so behind the Catholic Church in grappling with abuse. I don't have to tell you that behind each of these survivors represented here stands hundreds, thousands more across Christian parishes, congregations, and communities across the United States and indeed the world. I am absolutely indebted to the survivors and oftentimes also the spouses and the family members who are secondary survivors of clergy abuse, everyone who has entrusted their stories with me. And if any of you are here tonight, I want to assure you that no one I've interviewed will be named here tonight. I hold all of your stories with strictest confidence and anonymity at this point. And I want you to know you are protected. Most are very much not in the media, the people that I've interviewed, but some of them are, and even they can tell me things that are private or confidential, and I will hold that in trust. Everything I am doing in this project is dedicated to you, those of you who are survivors and family members and supporters of survivors. So you've all heard from Paula. I am a scholar of American Christianity with a long interest in the history of divisions over gender, race, and sexuality. In March of 2020, I was selected by a group of Catholic historians and archivists to be one of about a dozen scholars working on different aspects of the clergy abuse crisis in the U.S. Catholic Church. This project was called Gender, Sex, and Power: Toward a History of Clergy Sex Abuse in the U.S. Catholic Church. Terry McKiernan from Bishop Accountability was one of the project's leaders, and others were scholars from the University of Notre Dame and Northwestern. Our group met frequently over the next 2 years over Zoom because of the pandemic, and we presented our work at a public conference at Notre Dame in March of 2022. So this is the poster from our final research symposium in March of 2022. You can read a lot more about this project online for anyone who's interested, and also view the videos of most of the conference presentations if you Google that. I put the YouTube address at the bottom of this slide. So, or you can just go on YouTube and Google Gender, Sex, and Power, Notre Dame Symposium, something like that. But as you can see from this list, scholars worked on a variety of projects. Some were on particular survivors or specific priest abusers or dioceses. In one case, one scholar wrote about Sister Catherine Mulcairn, who played an important role in the Archdiocese of Boston under Cardinal Law. Other scholars looked at rehabilitation centers, such as the really infamous one that was run by Servants of the Paraclete in New Mexico for many years. Other scholars looked at predatory behavior toward Native American children in Alaska and elsewhere. And one scholar explored reproductive injustice, such as the numerous abortions that some abusive priests have coerced upon women and girls whom they have raped and impregnated. So it was a lot of really tough but important stuff, and the research was really extraordinary. Several articles from that project are now in the process of being published, along with a couple that are evolving into book projects, and my own is among them. I am now writing a book. So my own work began with sort of a dual focus. I was in the beginning particularly interested in women whose voices had not yet been heard, female survivors and victims especially. And I decided that I needed to focus my research in a particular geographic area just to manage it somehow. And so I started looking into the rich files in California. And I want to say right away that in looking at women's voices, I was not in any way and would never discount the voices of men or male survivors, or to suggest that women's abuse is more important than the abuse of men. It really came out of a sense that I had that a lot of the media coverage, starting with the Spotlight series, really going back before that, had focused a lot more on men and male survivors, and that there were women who felt they'd been sort of lost in the shuffle, or that the abuse of women was sort of normalized, the abuse of women and girls. So I wanted to sort of rectify that imbalance. And I looked particularly at the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, where Roger Mahoney was a longtime cardinal. And, there's clearly been a lot of abuse as well as a lot of cover-up of abuse in that archdiocese. But along the way, I decided that felt too narrow to do that. And so I began to expand and research and interview women sort of across a much broader geographic range who were survivors of child and adolescent abuse. And I was interested in the ways that gender might especially matter in the abuse of girls. And a third section of that paper, I was also interested maybe in what seems particularly Catholic about abuse in Catholic contexts. I was the only scholar in that Notre Dame group who was not raised Catholic or is not Catholic. I was the only Protestant in the group. And that was very interesting for me. I think the thought within the group of scholars was that I, as a sort of token Protestant, might see aspects of Catholic tradition that could facilitate abuse. The extraordinary veneration for priests, for instance, that in theory is very different from most Protestant views of the ministry, or other kinds of things that might not occur to Catholic scholars who were steeped in a Catholic upbringing. So let me just say a word. I need to tell you this. My own religious background, I think it's important to acknowledge, is Southern Baptist. I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee in the 1970s and 1980s. This was, some of you know, a period of extraordinary turmoil in the denomination known as the Southern Baptist Convention. My mother was the longtime pastor's secretary under, I think, 3 successive pastors at the historic First Baptist Church of Chattanooga. So church politics and behind the scenes drama was a constant dinner table conversation in my house, really more than I wanted at the time, but it set me up really well to be a religion scholar later on. These photos, the photos at the top left, that is the Southern Baptist Convention headquarters in Nashville. You may know that the Southern Baptists don't like being called a denomination or an organization. They want to say an organization does not exist. And I'm going to go into detail about that later on. Church autonomy is a really important principle for Southern Baptists. But you see that it exists enough to have a campus, a fairly large building there in Nashville. The other 2 photos are of First Baptist Church of Jacksonville, Florida. I think it gives you a good sense of what a lot of larger Southern Baptist churches, the megachurch sized churches look like today. And that's a relatively mainstream Southern Baptist church, kind of in the center of Southern Baptist life, and also representative of white evangelicalism more broadly in the United States. Unlike the wide variety of Baptists that existed in my childhood, when Jimmy and Rosalind Carter and Jerry Falwell could coexist in the same denomination, a planned takeover of sorts of the denomination that was planned going back into the 1960s successfully purged so-called liberals from Baptist seminaries and mission organizations and churches across the nation and indeed the globe. Some have called it a fundamentalist takeover, which is how I was raised to think of it in my church context. The more positive rendering is the conservative resurgence, which is what people who are in the denomination still today refer to it as. This denominational history is complicated, but it's really important to the story that I'm telling about the sexual abuse crisis now confronting American evangelicalism. And I would be glad to talk more about this history if anyone is interested at the end. I can't possibly do justice to it here. The shift toward fundamentalism is also a history deeply entwined with the rise of Christian nationalism in the US much more broadly, and the oft-cited statistic of 81% of white evangelicals in the US who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, with some trepidation often, many times, and then again in 2020 with a great deal more enthusiasm. So that's really important historical context. Okay, in any case, I spent 2 years focused on the crisis in the Catholic Church, interviewing a dozen or more survivors, and I'm deeply grateful to the many people who helped me connect to those survivors who then connected me to others. But while I was focused on that Catholic story, the Southern Baptist Convention, the annual meetings were blowing up over clergy sexual abuse that had finally caught national attention, thanks to a number of really intrepid journalists. And I just want to call out the journalists who don't always get the credit that they deserve. Robert Downen in Texas, who I'm going to refer to again in a moment. Liam Adams at the Tennessean, who's done incredible work in this area. There's lots I could name. Bob Smetana and Adele Banks at Religion News Service, and a number of other RNS reporters like Catherine Post as well. Also occasional but very important pieces by religion reporters like Sarah Pulliam Bailey and Michelle Boorstein, who are both at the Washington Post. Also, reporters writing for actual Christian media, such as Mark Wingfield of Baptist News Global, and of course, Julie Roys of the Roys Report, have done really crucial work on clergy abuse, not only in Southern Baptist settings, but in a wide array of non-denominational evangelical churches far beyond Baptist, many of them megachurches. But oftentimes those churches have their roots in Baptist culture and Baptist history, so they're quite similar in many ways. Some of you may know a few important documentary films have also come out that's helped illuminate some of this history. Shiny Happy People came out and was widely acclaimed and widely viewed last summer. This is about the Duggar family, who were deeply influenced by the fundamentalist Baptist Bill Gothard. Let Us Pray, another really incredible documentary series that came out last summer and focused on sexual abuse in circles heavily influenced by Bill Gothard. And also I want to mention a slightly older and shorter documentary done by local incredible journalists in Oregon called No Mercy. And this is about the courageous survivor, Tanya Culver Humphrey, who was abused for years by her father, who was the co-founder of Mercy Corps. And there's a trial coming up this June, and I encourage you, if you haven't heard her story, to look up her story as well. Krista Brown and Dee Miller, these are two of the really most formidable Southern Baptist survivors, or survivors of abuse in Southern Baptist context. Neither of them is Southern Baptist anymore. They've both been in the trenches a very long time. Dee, even before Krista, Dee's really considered, I think, the first survivor to come forward in the Southern Baptist context, at least the first one that we have real records of her coming forward. This book, Dee is the author of several books. This is one of her important books, Enlarging Boston Spotlight. And Krista is just about to publish a new memoir, Baptist Land, a memoir of abuse, betrayal, and transformation. That's coming out in May. These survivors and others have helped connect me with a whole range of other Baptist or Baptist adjacent experts, and that includes social workers and therapists, lawyers, spouses of survivors, and yes, even pastors, a number of pastors within the SBC who are working on abuse reform from within. And that's been really fascinating for me to get to know some of those men and the kind of work they are doing in very difficult circumstances, in some cases, with a lot of forces arrayed against them. So I've now spent over a year interviewing Baptists, as well as some other scattered evangelical and other Protestant survivors, some African-American as well as white survivors, although the majority of those that I found so far have been white. I've also interviewed some survivors in more liberal churches, the Episcopal Church, the Methodists, and I have a lot more to do there. I've got a lot more interviews with the conservative evangelical groups than I do with the mainline, and that's one thing I hope you all will help me with here tonight. So for most of the years that the Catholic scandal has played out in the media, most Protestant lay people have assumed that their own denominations were, for the most part, exempt from the problem of the sexual abuse of minors by clergy. Certainly the occasional case would appear now and then, but there were few or no signs really of any systematic cover-ups such as seemed to be rife within the Catholic hierarchy. There might have even been just a little bit of gloating over the fact that the Catholics had all these problems with sexual abuse, and aren't we lucky we don't? But this perception began to change, particularly in 2019, when an explosive series of investigative reports was published in the Houston Chronicle, detailing widespread sexual abuse of girls and boys at the hands of Southern Baptist ministers in multiple locations. I mentioned Robert Downen earlier. He was one of a team of journalists at the Houston Chronicle and another Texas media outlet that did extraordinary work when covering this story. This is sort of the spotlight of Southern Baptists, the Spotlight series in the Boston Globe. A team of reporters discovered accusations against, at the time, 380 church leaders. So that included pastors, deacons, youth ministers, choir directors, missionaries, Sunday school teachers, and so forth, who had allegedly, over the past 20 years, sexually abused more than 700 victims. In a story that's all too familiar to Catholic survivors, many perps continued working in Baptist churches, even after the abuse had been reported, verified, or even assault charges had been filed against them with law enforcement, the Chronicle reported. Still more shockingly, an independent, in-depth report that was commissioned under fire by the Southern Baptist officials and released in 2022. This is known as the Guidepost Report, named for the organization that put the report together. This report announced the existence of a secret list that was kept by Southern Baptist officials of, I think it was 703 abusers, even as those same officials had claimed and had taken very little action to see that they were reported to law enforcement or prevented from working in SBC churches. It was actually a very parallel story to a lot of what was uncovered some years ago in Catholic dioceses. Abuse allegations, the report said, were often mishandled in a manner that involved the mistreatment of survivors. Because SBC leaders' main concern, I'm still quoting, their main concern was avoiding any potential liability for the SBC, end quote. This story has generated and continues to generate widespread attention. And as the numbers continue to rise and the scandalous circumstances surrounding them become visible, it's really swelled into a crisis, much like that which engulfed the Catholic Church. The SBC in June, I would say, leaders sought to deflect this attention by kicking out churches that support women pastors. But that's another story, and that may not be a fair way to characterize that. So I will let my Southern Baptist friends correct me on that. But it's been really slow in seeing changes happen, even changes that Southern Baptist officials have promised. Okay. So my book project then is studying clergy sexual abuse across American Christianity, with particular attention to the U.S. Catholic Church and the Southern Baptists, but with a great deal of attention paid to other church contexts as well. Now, just an aside, prior to the rise of the New Christian Right in the 1970s, of course, all of you know that Catholics and Baptists were bitter enemies who believed they had next to nothing in common with one another. In fact, there's a long history of Protestant anti-Catholicism in this country, dating back to some of the earliest Catholics coming to the United States. These are a couple of rather horrific cartoons that were published in the 1920s by the KKK, who really were as anti-Catholic. They targeted Catholics as well as other groups. So you see here on the left, sort of the Vatican is seen as sneaking into the country under the guise of the American flag. And Catholics are going to overturn public schools. They're going to destroy the nation. They're bringing propaganda into the country. And over here on the right, you see the KKK leaders are, chopping down the tree of Catholicism in order to save the American nation. There's a lot of Protestant anti-Catholic writing and cartoons dating well back into the 19th century. Protestants for decades taught their children that Catholicism was idolatry, that the papacy, or popery as they often called it, was an ungodly human invention, that Catholics revered Mary and the saints over Jesus, and so forth, much else besides. And many taught that, the Catholic Church indeed was trying to take over the U.S. government. You remember there were those controversies when John F. Kennedy was a candidate and then was elected president in 1960. And I would say an unknown number of Protestants continue to believe that much of this is true, though with much less violence and vehemence, perhaps, than there once was. Um, at the same time, Catholic teaching instructs Catholics that theirs is the one true church. I would say there's also been a history of Catholic anti-Protestantism. It's harder to uncover in cartoons, let me tell you. I've tried. There are some, but they date pretty far back. But I thought maybe these books would be somewhat representative, a little bit of sort of a genre of literature that's out there, to sort of prove to Protestants why they're completely wrong about everything, and that Catholicism is the one true church. So Protestants, including Baptists, who are, of course, a subset of Protestants, they've been viewed as heretics who set themselves up arrogantly as their own religious authorities. They've been seen to misinterpret virtually everything about the Christian tradition and Christian teaching. And having long persecuted Catholics in America, they're not to be trusted. So there's a long history, this kind of hatred or at least mistrust between Catholics and Protestants. This has certainly diminished over time. And particularly, it diminished in the closing decades of the 20th century as Protestants and Catholics sort of saw their way toward making common ground on political issues. So conservative Catholics and conservative Protestants, and that included Baptists, could sort of join together on conservative political issues. The liberals, liberal Catholics, liberal Protestants, as well as Jews and seculars, could also sort of collaborate on a range of political issues at the same time. On the conservative side, some of these collaborations have been grounded in a particular view of women and of female submission to male authority. This is Bill Gothard's umbrella of protection, which you'll remember if you watched Shiny Happy People. This probably appeared in Let Us Pray as well, the documentary. And this is simply showing that the wife is to put herself under the husband's authority. The husband places himself under Christ's authority. And that's the way for the family to flourish and to receive God's protection from disaster and destruction. The contrasting image on the right is from a graphic in the evangelical magazine Christianity Today of egalitarianism. So this is more the model of men and women, being in balance, being equal based on the foundation of the Bible. It's still heteronormative. It's not liberal in any sense, but it is a contrast to that more complementarian or authoritarian model on the left. Now, I bring this up because most researchers on clergy abuse agree that the theology of gender hierarchy and subservience, or again, what many adherents on the Protestant side anyway call complementarianism. I don't know that Catholics call it that. You can tell me. But this gender ideology has played an important role in the sexual abuse crises confronting the American churches more generally. And the theory goes, as you would think, that the all-male Catholic priesthood and evangelical ministry have facilitated parallel cultures of what is called clericalism, in which leaders can adopt the assumption and reinforce it among one another that they're not necessarily accountable to the laity, that they exist on a higher plane than the laity, and that to some degree they can be above the law. So this is a sort of depiction of the priesthood from, I think, medieval times. This is a more recent, very contrasting image, but in striking ways quite similar of contemporary evangelical ministerial model, which is sort of the softer patriarchy. And oftentimes these evangelical pastors today will wear jeans and rumpled shirts and want to look like one of the people. But there's still this very strong assumption that they stand above the laity in all kinds of ways. And what this assumption can result in, it doesn't always, but it can result in a lack of transparency, and in some cases, a downright lawlessness, frankly, that has allowed sexual abuse to continue largely unchecked in some specific religious organizations. And as we are hearing in news reports nearly every day now, some, by refusing to follow civil law and report sexual abuse allegations when they are raised, high-level leaders in both Catholic and evangelical contexts have committed crimes that are no less significant than sexual abuse itself, simply by not following the law when they are mandatory reporters and are supposed to report these allegations. Now, I bring all of this up about male priesthood. I'm not trying to prove that the all-male clergy structure causes sexual abuse. I am not trying to say that. I don't believe that. I don't say that. I'm not even sure I'm saying it worsens sexual abuse, though I have some questions maybe about that. But I certainly do think that the gender models that are really deeply embedded in Christianity, that these are important to understand and analyze in the context of sexual abuse. And to pretend they have nothing to do with this, I think is to be an ostrich, digging one's head in the sand. I think we have to think about that gender ideology in some ways, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Above all, I want to join the fight that many of you are in against the indifference so many church leaders still show to survivors. I love this cartoon. I have this cartoon tacked above my desk where I write to give me motivation and remind me why I am doing this. This is a woman standing before a sort of, panel of all men. They could be clergy, they could be congressmen, they could be corporate executives, and she has obviously disclosed abuse, and they're saying it's not that we don't believe your story, it's that we don't care. I hope that's not true. I know that's not true of all, but it's hard to argue that it's not true of some. And that is why I am doing the work that I'm doing. And I know that a lot of others of you too, is to fight back against that and make them care. Okay, so a few more details then to get more specific about my project. So I'm still very much in the interview and asking questions stage. And really what would help me from all of you is to know what you want to know about comparing abuse situations and survivors and strategies for accountability and reform across Christian churches and denominations. Really, there's very little, if anything, few studies that have looked at these together, Catholic, Protestant context across the board. And I think there is a lot that we can learn from doing so. So what am I doing? To date, I have done over 100 formal interviews. As I say, I'm still doing interviews. That's just where I am today. Plus a lot more off-the-record conversations for further background and context. I don't have a so-called scientific method for finding survivors. I have found them through my original Notre Dame Scholars Group and connections through Terry McKiernan at Bishop Accountability. I found them through SNAP and the help of folks like David Clossy and Barb Doris and other past and present SNAP affiliates. I found some through Awake, formerly Awake Milwaukee, the survivor group there that really works more directly within the Catholic Church. I've found interviewees through networks of Baptist survivors, networks of adult female survivors, survivors of adult clergy sexual abuse, and many other networks. I've also reached out directly to people whose stories I've read in newspaper accounts. I've gotten word of mouth. People have approached me who have heard about my project. So I would really love to talk to anyone who wishes to speak to me and speak with survivors of all kinds across a spectrum. And as you see, I've listed my email address there for you to email me at any time. Of the formal interviews I've done with adults, all of my interviews are with adults. I'm not interviewing anyone who is a minor. 80 self-disclosed to me or to media before me that they are survivors. Some have already told their stories publicly with their names attached, others have not. And even those who have shared stories publicly, sometimes have shared new details with me that they really don't want me to write about, or certainly it could only be related anonymously. And that brings me to a really important point that my the default option is complete anonymity and confidentiality in my study. I will protect everyone's identity, and only those who opt directly to have their real names on their accounts will have that. And some do want that. Some want their names in there, and I absolutely honor that. No one has to make the decision when they are interviewed. I'm going to go back to everyone before publishing the book to make sure they're comfortable that their story is still a part of it, with how their story is portrayed. This is not typical in scholarly research. Usually people agree to be interviewed and then they sort of give away all rights to whatever was said in the interview. I don't believe in doing that in this project. I really have a moral conviction to follow a trauma-informed approach to this and not re-traumatize survivors. I think it's the only respectful way to write about survivor stories. So that's why I'm really doing everything I can so that no one feels that they were presented, even anonymously, in a way that they would not have chosen to be in this project. I should also say that, so I'm under contract with Yale University Press. It's a scholarly press, but it's being written for a much broader, public audience, like many of you here. They've told me up front that their legal department is going to be going over the manuscript with a fine-tooth comb to protect their own liability. So I'm highly unlikely to be able to help any survivor achieve justice the way an investigative journalist might, but I can help direct people to those folks. So I want to be clear, I'm not going to be able to tell everyone's story in detail. I'm not going to be able to finally bring justice for folks, but I can certainly be a help, I hope, in that process in connecting folks to those who can. The remainder of my interviews are with family members, with allies and advocates, with pastors and church staff, as I mentioned earlier. Also, I've interviewed lawyers, therapists, journalists, and other scholars. There are a lot of people who have been working in this area for a very long time. And I'm well aware that I am a newcomer in this space. And so, again, I want to be completely respectful and to learn from the many, many voices who are out there already. The great Marie Fortune, for instance, who has been writing about clergy sexual abuse since the early 1980s, and is still around. And I tracked her down, and she's just been a wonderful help to me. So from her to scholars like David Pooler at Baylor University, who is now doing, David is doing some of the most important work, particularly on adult clergy sexual abuse, but not only on that, many, many important topics in this area. His work is an inspiration to me, and he's been a great help to me already. And also I'm interested in younger scholars, newly emerging scholars who are working on subjects such as cultural betrayal trauma, the distinctive trauma that is of Black church members, for instance, who are abused by Black pastors, or Asian American Christians abused by Asian American clergy. Cultural betrayal trauma refers to the unique harm perpetrated when an abuser comes from one's own marginalized community. So you're already, marginalized, oppressed by the larger society, and then someone from within that safe community abuses you. That's what cultural betrayal trauma refers to. There are emergent scholars working in that area. I'm not sure I'm supposed to mention their names yet, but I'm learning from them as well. So there's all kinds of experts out there that I'm learning from and will continue to learn from. Okay, back to the interviews. So of the current interviews, I would say about a third have been with people abused in Catholic context. A third were abused in Southern Baptist context or sort of adjacent Baptist contexts. And a third in more other evangelical churches or non-denominational churches or smaller denominations like Christian and Missionary Alliance. And as you'll see, that doesn't leave much room for the mainline or more liberal Protestant subjects, because I have very, very few of those. Not quite statistically insignificant, but close. So I've really got a lot of work to do in that area. I've also had a research assistant who has been working on abuse in Orthodox Jewish communities. And of course, the scope could be expanded exponentially. There are other scholars out there in the world that I'm in conversation with who are working on abuse in American Buddhist contexts, in American Muslim contexts, and on and on and on. But we all have to stop somewhere. And so my focus is American Christianity, which is broad enough and overwhelming enough. I want to understand what is similar and what is different about the structures in which abuse takes place and is covered up. I also want to understand best practices for prevention and accountability, the role of theology and all of this. And this is really where the Catholics have a lot to teach the Protestants, because the Catholics have really been at this a lot longer than most Protestant denominations have been, especially these kind of evangelical floater non-denominational groups. So I'm hoping one reason to study these things together is so that some of the Protestant groups don't just reinvent the wheel. There's resources, great resources that have been deeply vetted and thought through on the Catholic side, and I want to make sure those are made available. Of the current interviewees, I would say about 10% identify as African American, Asian American, Latina, or persons of color. That's really a terrible percentage for me. I think most of you are well aware that the vast majority of participants in survivor organizations in the US identify as white, like SNAP and Awake. And sexual abuse in marginalized communities is greatly underreported. But we know that in the Catholic context, priests who were known abusers for some decades were frequently sent to parishes in marginalized communities, poor Black communities in the rural South, for instance, Native American communities in states such as Alaska, New Mexico, and others. So a number of scholars are now working on projects focused on Native American communities and survivors, but very little beyond a smattering of newspaper articles exists on African American and Asian American communities and survivors. So I've worked very hard to find the people I've interviewed who are from underrepresented marginalized groups. And I very much want to interview others and also facilitate people finding each other, frankly, because so many of the folks I have interviewed have said they don't feel comfortable in SNAP because of how white it is. They've also expressed to me their isolation, even sometimes from their own communities when they've reported abuse. So there's really a huge underreported group of survivors that I very much want to try to find and interview if I can build trust in those communities and do that. Also in my group, a significant number of my interviews were abused as adults. I mentioned David Pooler's research on adult clergy sexual abuse. These are often adult women, often married women in many cases, church secretaries, members of church staff, women who have gone to pastors for counseling, sometimes marriage counseling with their husbands, and wind up being manipulated into really devastating relationships that are deeply confusing and perplexing, and are sort of leading the way into sexual relationships that the women have been really coerced into. So I've interviewed women coming out of those situations, also Catholic women who have been in relationships with priests, or what they considered relationships at the time, and later came to see as sexual abuse. Sometimes were impregnated by them. As I mentioned earlier, there have been accounts of abortions that were coerced on women, but also women who have had children by priests are in my interview group. And that is a very powerful and extremely devastating particular circumstance indeed. It won't surprise this group, I'm sure, to hear that survivors who have talked with me have described a very broad range of religious affiliation or spiritual identity. Many of my earliest Catholic interviewees came through SNAP. So I think that the strong anti-Catholic, anti-church voice was perhaps overrepresented there. I mean, there's certainly SNAP, people are involved in SNAP who have remained Catholic, but there's a strong cohort of people who've really left the church. And I think some of my early interviews kind of overrepresented that. I've now got a wider range, including survivors who have very much remained Catholic, or 1 foot in and 1 foot out Catholics. And I've also got a fairly wide range among Protestant survivors of those who have retained faith in God, or remained in the church or a church, not usually the church in which they were abused, but remain in a church and still believe in the church. I've interviewed Protestant survivors with one foot in and one foot out. And I've certainly interviewed Protestants, including Baptists, who have left it altogether and would never go back, but maybe still have a strong sense of a relationship with God or some other spiritual identity. And finally, what I want to mention that I'm also very interested in understanding the impact of abuse on survivors' politics. Many survivors and other white evangelicals have long been raised to believe that to be Christian is to vote Republican, period. No ifs, ands, or buts, no local exceptions. The GOP might as well stand for God's own party in some of these settings. No matter what Republican is nominated for office, that person should receive Christians' votes. A large percentage of conservative evangelicals really been steeped in that for quite some time. But many of the adult evangelical abuse survivors that I have interviewed have begun to question this equation in very, very interesting and potentially significant ways. And some of them have described it to me in this way. They've come to realize that part of what made them vulnerable to abuse in the first place was being taught not to question authority, being taught to believe everything that their priest or their pastor said or did to be good and right. A kind of naivete, as some have used that word very strongly to talk about the way that they were raised to think about clergy. And when, in the case of abuse, it turned out to be very much not right, that a pastor was doing something terribly wrong, their eyes sort of opened to the fact that perhaps other truisms they had been taught about church, such as Democrats are evil or anti-Christian, or that Republicans are the only party that hold Christian values, that these things might not be true either. It cracked open a door to think differently about politics. And particularly, I think, in the case of Donald Trump being known to be a sexual abuser, as determined by the court in Jean Carroll's case, the Access Hollywood tape in which he said it was routine for him to grab women by the genitals, and based on highly credible evidence in many other cases. Because of all of that, the majority of abuse survivors whom I've interviewed and asked about their political trajectory have told me that Trump's candidacy sickens them in some way. They can't vote for him again. And this includes survivors who actually did vote for him in 2016 and 2020. I've seen this as a pattern in some of my interviews. I'm not just talking about one or two people. And I'm interested in knowing if this is true more broadly, or if I just happen to have interviewed a small segment of people who have made that connection between abusers in the church and abusers in politics or other spaces. So that's really something that I am continuing to investigate. So I need to sit down and actually write this book. So I'm beginning to slow down on the interviews. But again, I'm very much interested in hearing from more people. So please do feel free to reach out to me at this email address, mgriffith@wustl.edu, or share my contact information with others. Now, I'm going to have a few more remarks for a few minutes, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, if that worked. Paula, you can tell me if that did not work. And I just want to make a few kind of wrap up comments before I go to the Q&A and see your questions. So just to wrap up a bit, what feels similar and what feels different about the context and realities of sexual abuse in the U.S. Catholic Church versus the Southern Baptist and other evangelical groups? I think it's a fascinating question for at least two reasons. First, if just thinking about Catholic and Baptist standing in for other evangelical groups, the two churches are structured completely differently. The hierarchy of the Catholic Church is very complex, both vertically and horizontally. There are countless church offices and officers to staff them. It's very difficult for a Protestant like me to kind of understand it all. A very thick hierarchy. And this is really, traditionally at least, the very opposite of Baptists and other evangelicals. Baptists emerged from the Puritans, and like their Puritan brethren, the Baptists who arose in 17th century New England, this would be Roger Williams in Rhode Island, they intentionally rejected the hierarchy of both the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church, whose persecution they had fled in England. So Baptists have long been really anti-authority, anti-hierarchy, anti-creedal. Traditionally, they proudly upheld the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. That is that the belief that no human being is sacramentally closer to God than another. That every believer in the Baptist tradition has both the privilege and the duty to discern certain theological details for themselves through close reading of the scripture, prayer, and intentional community with other Baptists. And those are views held, again, much more widely by a lot of other evangelical groups. I'm not sure you hear a lot about the priesthood of all believers anymore, because the current Southern Baptists have become far more creedal and rigid about what churches can and cannot do to be in fellowship with the SBC, but I digress. So whereas the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church has been utilized, and some would say weaponized at times, to hide and protect abusive priests, there is technically no such hierarchy among Baptists. Every Baptist church is purportedly autonomous. And while they voluntarily gather into this organization called the Southern Baptist Convention for mission and financial purposes, the SBC supposedly has no authority over local congregations. That does turn out to be misleading. The SBC is disfellowshipping and has disfellowship churches for things like women pastors. But in any case, it's a legal strategy for them, the focus on autonomy. It's an argument that there is no such institution as the Southern Baptist Church, and therefore there's no liability beyond the local congregation if there happens to be an abuser there. Non-denominational evangelical churches and what are called church plants have even less of an institutional hierarchy. They might have collaborative relationships or partnerships with other congregations, but many have no authority structure or accountability structure beyond their own pastoral staff. And I can't tell you what an accountability problem that is. I mean, that's just a huge issue in all of this. But of course, it makes for good legal arguments as well if it comes to that. Okay, so the church structure, how different the church structure is and yet how similar some of these things turn out to be is really fascinating. And the other fascinating dimension to the comparison I've already mentioned, which is the gender, the sort of gender ideology that I think is very similar across these lines. That only men are allowed to be Catholic priests and evangelical pastors in most evangelical settings. This wasn't always true for Baptists or other groups, but it is largely true now. Both churches teach a strict gender binary in which God created male and female. And that's traditionally, most everybody believed that, but that's come under question in recent years. And these church bodies have had to deal with and really wrestle with LGBTQ issues. And they've wrestled with these things in quite similar ways. So there's a lot, I think, to compare across these lines that's really very interesting. There's the culture of clericalism that I mentioned earlier, that in the Catholic Church has real parallels to many of these Protestant settings. Again, this kind of sense of the male hierarchy being set above the laity. And I've had a lot of survivors actually say that they feel like they woke up out of a fog of having been brainwashed, having not seen that hierarchy when they were in these settings. So I found that very, very interesting, the ways in which some of these churches kind of really enculture people to think that this is normal, for pastors to have complete power and authority and control with no accountability structure whatsoever. I have to thank my Baptist mother for teaching me what I now realize is a healthy skepticism of authority. I guess being a church secretary in her time, you know, she all saw the negative stuff. So I was not raised to see pastors quite in that light. I feel like I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to wrap up here and say a few other things I could talk about. I mentioned earlier, I'm interested in what feels Catholic about abuse in Catholic settings, you know, the particular settings in which it takes place, the rectory, the parochial school, the ritual practices that sometimes intermingle with abuse. My interviews have taught me a lot about that. And again, I think we see clear parallels in Baptist and other evangelical settings. In the evangelical world, the highest theological authority is the Bible. And it's become quite clear to me that evangelical predator pastors are very adept at weaponizing scripture to make their abuse seem something holy and even ordained by God. There are a number of New Testament scriptural passages that seem to come up again and again in this context. So I'm really interested in looking at the weaponization of scripture and its effectiveness in many evangelical settings as part of the grooming process. Also, the way that counseling has been allowed to sort of flourish in evangelical settings, really with no professional training standards whatsoever. So there's a lot to talk about these very different cultures, and yet with parallels. So just to conclude, I want to say again, it's really early for me in all of this. A lot of what I'm saying is, you know, still speculative. It's based on evidence coming out in my interviews, but I haven't sat down and coded it all yet. I very much welcome your feedback as well as your questions, which will help me shape this project as I move forward into the writing phase. I think that Catholics and evangelicals and really Protestants more generally have a lot to learn from each other. I really want to stress that again. They have a lot to learn from each other about the dynamics of abuse in their distinctive religious settings. Also, they have a lot to learn about structures of accountability and justice. The Southern Baptists especially have a lot to learn from Catholics here, as they are at least 20 years behind in acknowledging the depth of their own abuse problem and developing strategies to prevent as well as address it head on, and to protect both children and adults from sexual abuse within their walls. So with that, I am going to turn to your questions and comments, if that's okay, Paula, unless there's anything that you want to say at this point. Oh boy.
No,
Oh
Marie,
my goodness.
that's fine. That's fine. I'm just looking at some of the questions
Yes.
in the Q&A box. Do you see them?
I do, and
Okay.
I'm so appreciative. I'm gonna go down the line, and I'm not
Okay.
gonna be able to get to everything. So please, if I don't get to you, I hope you will email me if you can. But I'm so thankful to those of you who are outing yourselves as interviewees, and thank you for your kind words. You all inspire me, you survivors. I'm gonna have to take a screenshot of this so that when I'm depressed in my project sometime, I'm gonna have these kind words.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hannah Kate. Thank you, Krista. Thank you, Chris, Shelley, Diane, all of you. Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm, you guys, this is very kind. Okay, let me see if I can.
Are you in the Q&A or the chat?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm in the chat. I'm sorry. Okay.
That's
Back to
okay.
the Q&A.
That's okay.
The chat. Okay, thank you all in the chat, and I'll go back to that later. Okay, so
Diane has one.
yeah, yeah. Just give me a minute to read, and then I'll respond. You know, Diane, I'm seeing your question. Is anyone studying what paralyzes so many people with credible allegations of abuse come up in their churches, and why at the same time they have all kinds of energy to rally around the clergy offender? Yes, I see this again and again, as you do. And it's as perplexing for me as it is you. I mean, I think that there is something about the enculturation, the way children are steeped to believe in authority and kind of go with the program and hang in there. And rebellion is frowned on. And somehow, when a survivor comes forward, even survivors who have been a part of the program their whole lives, because most of you that I've interviewed, you were that. You were good Christian girls and boys. You believed it. You were doing the good things you were supposed to do. And then you come forward as a victim, and suddenly the backs are turned against you. And I've just heard devastating stories of rejection at that point. And the clergy offenders, as you say, are embraced. I don't know who's doing research on that. David Pooler, who's here, or at least has been here tonight, may know better than I do, but it's a crucial dynamic, I think, to analyze. So I very much appreciate that. Hermina, thank you. Research on clergy abuse in the Eastern Orthodox Church. So there is a scholar named Aram, A-R-A-M, Sarkisian, S-A-R-K-I-S-I-A-N. That's an Armenian name, of course, but he is studying clergy abuse in the Russian Orthodox Church. And I know that there are others out there. So that's the only name that immediately comes to my mind. But I think there are definitely folks out there who are starting to talk about this, and journalists, I think, who have gotten to this. Hannah Kate, hello. Interested in how SBC grooms young men into becoming ordained ministers who have had traumatic stories and end up becoming abusers themselves. So yes, and that's a parallel, I think, in some Catholic cases as well. You know, we know that there have been Catholic abuse victims who have themselves become priests or church leaders of some kind. And I'm no expert on this at all. And I would assume the majority of them have not been abusers themselves, but a minority of them have also been abusers. And I think, I don't know of any research in this area, Hannah Kate, but I absolutely think that this is really crucial. There's also, I think I would look to the secular world for research on that general topic about children who were abused to become abusers themselves. I'm sure there's good research out there in the psychology world, in various social science worlds that I don't know nearly as well as I know religious history. But I'll keep that in mind and let you know if I think of anything. Okay, Chris. Yeah, okay, so Chris O'Leary asks, why have there been more boys than girls as abuse victims for the Catholics and the reverse for the SBC? Is this pure coincidence? So the numbers, a lot of people are really working on these numbers, and I will tell you there's disagreement, I think, in the scholarly community. I've seen, there are still scholarly studies that say 80% of clergy abuse victims in the Catholic Church are male, but far more people now believe that number is much closer to something like 60%. And it's just that there were fewer female victims coming forward early on, and that more of those women have, or we've expanded the definition of abuse to include more things that happen to girls and not just boys. But I think there's a lot of uncertainty about the numbers because so many people don't come forward. And I think the same is true on the Baptist side. I suspect there are far more male victims on the Baptist side than we know about. So I would say that in the end, the number may turn out to be closer to a 50-50 number among Baptists and other evangelicals than what we know right now. There have been some very active male survivors. David Pittman was on my first slide. He's been a very active as a male survivor. The Houston Chronicle series included many men who were survivors of clergy abuse in Baptist settings. So the numbers are just unclear at this point. And I think it's very, very important, but very, very hard to get at. So thank you for the question. Okay, Dominic, the umbrella image relating to abuse. The connection that I'm making is not specifically to abuse there, but it's to an authoritarian structure in which women are taught to be submissive to male authority at all cost. And we do know that that can contribute to women believing they have no recourse when they are abused. They've been told not to leave abusive marriages, that sort of thing. So that's the kind of link that I'm making there. I am not trying to say that gender hierarchy causes abuse. I'm not trying to prove that here, but I think a lot of questions need to be asked about that relationship, and I'm ready to ask them. Are any of these churches required to offer units on clergy sexual abuse after they are caught with perps in their parochial schools? Seems like this may help. Yeah, I mean, you all know more about what churches have done, Paula, and others who, working in the archdiocese. My impression is that Catholic dioceses have done a lot now to really make up for decades of not doing a lot or hoping the problem goes away. But I don't know, Paula, do you want to address Cassandra's question?
I would just want to say that we have a long way to go. That I can't see the truth being the overall, that we have done well. Overall, I think there's lots of room for improvement.
Yeah. And Cassandra, you also asked, do you see any change at all, meaning any movement by churches toward really, really wanting to do better? Any survivor, as many survivors as you ask that question, you're going to get a different answer. And it probably depends on where all of us stand. And my answer is yes and no, I guess. So I really agree with the survivors who are very cynical, who say, look at these churches. And I'm talking now about the Evangelical and Baptist churches. So let me say, I'm going to keep the Catholic Church out of this because there's clearly been movement on the Catholic side. And yet, as Paula says, a long way to go. I think that there are still forces in place in the Southern Baptist Convention and in other evangelical settings that are doing their level darndest to not have real reform, to stifle real reform. We see this right now in the promises the SBC has made that have not been kept, the questions that they refuse to answer. There's a lot, and I've had some off-the-record conversations with some lawyers and others that have really been bone-chilling, quite frankly, about that. Do I believe that there are people within the congregations and pastors who are really working hard for reform? Absolutely. I have met amazing pastors, amazing church staff, amazing people who are really, really working on this and who worry that if we stop working on this and stop believing, the situation will be so much worse. You've got to have people on the inside that are still willing to pound and pound and pound and crack away at the resistance. So that's my yes and no answer. I think awareness is much greater than it used to be. And you've got a lot of people that are working very, very hard. I think children are safer in both the Catholic Church and the SBC overall than they were 50 years ago. But does that mean it's all fixed? Absolutely not. And I would still have a healthy skepticism toward all church authority. I mean, I think that's, for me, as a Christian, how do we not have a healthy skepticism towards our leaders? I'll stop there. Oh, Tim Lennon. Hi, Tim. It's nice to see you. And okay, great. Thank you for that reference. I appreciate that. Tiffany Zamora, thank you so much. And good to see you here. Is the SBC 20 years behind the Catholic Church because they got outed after the Catholic Church in 2019? Yes, that's essentially what I'm saying, is that they really didn't have a spotlight moment until 2019. They had local ones. I mean, there've been local, news stories all along the way. I remember some in Chattanooga from my childhood. So it's not like people thought there was no abuse, but there was really nothing about systemic abuse and cover up until that 2019 blockbuster series. Oh, okay. The portion of the study about political affiliations changing, or will it be another book or study? Yeah, I'm hoping it'll be part of this study, but as you can see, I'm trying to do a lot. And I don't want to write a 1,000-page book that no one can read. So at this point, I'm planning to include that, but it could well be that it morphs off into an article. I just don't know at this point. Someone says that in SNAP, there have always been about 50% women in groups, activities, and leadership. That's certainly, I was at the SNAP meeting last August, and it looked like at least 50% to me. And I know that's often always been the case. Are there changes in evaluation processes for ministers in any denomination that will or seem hopeful in possibly preventing abuse? I do believe so. So in the mainline churches, in the Episcopal Church, United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, and many, many others, the Mennonite Church of America, there are better procedures have been instituted in all of this. The problem is there are procedures on paper, and there are the people who might or might not actually follow them on the ground. And from what I can tell, a lot of things get dropped even when there are good procedures and processes in place. My worry is, I think I've hinted in this presentation, I worry about church plants a lot. I worry about these non-denominational independent churches because there's just no accountability and no one is saying, here's the process you must follow. Pastor Joe just goes out and decides to form his own church, and he might be a good guy, but he might be a predator. And the easiest thing to do is to create your own church and not put any of those structures in place, and to sort of find people who trust you, trusting people who have been taught to trust their leaders, good people, and then abuse them. So it's interesting because I have a healthy skepticism of institutions too, but I also really worry about these church plants. I think I've just heard of a lot of cases there that really, really worry me. And finally, Beth, if a non-denominational group that is predominantly Catholic in its membership in any way accountable to the local archdiocese, or does the archdiocese work with these groups? Paula, maybe you should answer this. I'm not sure of the answer to that.
If it's under the title of non-denominational, I don't think we would be aware of it unless they made us aware of it and we gave them our resources as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, let me see if did I get through all the questions
I
there?
think you did.
Questions so
I
far.
don't know if there's some in chat.
I'm gonna look back over to the chat. And I so appreciate these comments from you all. Paula, if there's some way for us to save that, I'd really be grateful.
Yeah, well, it's all recorded, so.
Okay, and someone asked, I would love to look at any statistical differences between churches with one senior pastor or priest and churches with a more shared shepherding approach. That is, I think, I really appreciate that comment. I think that's very, very important too. At the same time, I have definitely interviewed survivors who were in churches that had a kind of group of pastors, and this group itself were almost kind of, I don't want to say predatory, but it's an almost Animal House-like behavior. I had one story that's in my head of kind of almost Animal House-like behavior among pastors, sort of texting each other stuff and really misbehaving as a group. So I agree that I think it's really important both to look at the kind of single authority versus the group, but I don't think a group is the answer. It's not a simple answer to abuse, but still, I do think we need more studies of these church structures. That I think that point is very, very well taken. Yeah, so David Pooler, thank you for this. He writes, I wonder if the conservative takeover of Southern Baptist through the late 70s through the early 90s was a proxy and guise for gaining authority. That is certainly my point of view. And I'm very open about that because I know that my upbringing shaped that. And so I'm ready to be challenged on that, and I want to be by people who don't agree. It's just not a place where it's easy for me to be objective, but I think the historical data also shows that. So I think that there is that is provable that there was a sort of authoritarian power grab that we're still seeing. The same people who were in charge of that that takeover in the 60s and 70s and so forth are still extremely powerful today, even though their star has fallen. And I think many of us know who we're talking about. And thank you, Tiffany agrees with that too. Yeah, okay. And another question from David. One of the questions that he wonders about is if I'll be able to answer, is there a qualitative difference between the experience of abuse of adults in Catholic spaces and Protestant spaces? Certainly there are similarities, but I wonder what the differences are. Yeah, that's a very much a question that I have, David. Thank you. I don't have an answer at this point. I just don't have enough interviews, especially with Catholic survivors of adult abuse. I certainly have some, but not enough. And so I don't have a good answer for that yet, but I will definitely keep that in mind. Um, Thank you, Cassandra, for being grateful for my work. Yeah. Oh, units of curriculum focused on clergy sexual abuse within parochial schools for any of these organizations. I'm so glad you raised that. Thank you for raising that. Yes, I feel all children need to be raised with better knowledge of this, right? Children and adults. Because the problem is if we only teach children about abuse of children, then they're not necessarily primed to think about the ways they're still vulnerable as adults in a church setting or another organization. So I think we need better education at every level. Um, I don't know how we put that together. I mentioned Marie Fortune in my presentation. So Marie Fortune, some of you may remember, started an organization called the Faith Trust Institute. This was founded, I believe, in the very late 1970s or early 1980s. And very quickly, it focused on clergy abuse and on abuse in Christian settings. And they were called upon by Catholic and Protestant organizations for decades to help them prepare education curriculum for their children and their adults. I don't know what's happened to all that curricula. They developed seminary training curricula at Methodist and Presbyterian divinity schools and others. I've asked friends of mine who teach at those institutions now, do they still do that? No one's heard of it. So the sad thing is, I think a lot of effort was expended on educational resources, both for congregations, but also theological schools and other settings that's really been tossed or forgotten. And but I absolutely agree that better education at all levels. I know that the survivors I've interviewed are educating their children. I mean, there's no question that their children are more alert to what to look out for than they feel they were, when they were raised in the church. But a lot more needs to be done, for sure.
We do have curriculum in the Catholic setting for all ages, from kindergarten through high school. So we do have that curriculum.
Yeah, and is that diocese by diocese, or that's the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and sort of
The USCCB put that in the mandate in the 2002 code that they wrote, and that is part of it. That is part of safe environment of
Okay.
every archdiocese.
Yeah, another place where I think Protestants, instead of starting from scratch and inventing their own, should,
Yeah, right,
could really, go a long way and save a lot of time and
right.
money and effort if they would, borrow from your curricula. So thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting point, David. Ordination as a shame reduction technique, about how psychologically injured people move into clergy positions to reduce their own shame. Thank you. Okay, thank you for that reference. And hopefully others have seen that too. Oh, Elizabeth Ingram, I follow you on Twitter. You say you're writing your master's thesis on institutional betrayal of faith communities towards survivors of sex abuse and how that betrayal affects the mental health of survivors, PTSD and dissociation in particular. That is absolutely wonderful. And I can't wait to read that.
Mhm.
And I'd love to hear from you if you'd care to email me about that. Yeah, okay, this is, I appreciate this. So Hannah Kate has noted the SBC is silencing her with legal action. I mentioned earlier Tanya Culver Humphrey, who is about to go to trial because of the way Mercy Corps covered up her father's abuse and mistreated her, even though she was coming forward for years and years, much as Hannah Kate did. I mean, these are not survivors who, waited a long time to come forward. Not that I'm condemning that at all, but these were not survivors who, kind of had it in here for many, many years. They were speaking out all along the way and being cut down. And I think these legal cases, if you don't follow Hannah Kate and some of these other folks in the chat on X, Twitter, you should, because these are incredibly important and in some cases really, really heartbreaking cases. So yes, thank you for that. Okay, this is an interesting one. Again, someone writes, Kelly Knickerbocker, I've heard a lot about church planters in particular having high levels of narcissistic personalities, in addition to whatever their own shame stories are. So this is who is attracted to these positions. It's probably Chuck DeGroat's work, though I can't remember exactly. Yeah, thank you for that reminder. I've definitely read about that too. And, I'm not a psychologist, and so I'm always even terms like narcissism, which I invoke, but I tread carefully because I feel like I'm out of my depth. So it's really helpful to be reminded of other work that is there. Yeah, thank you, Chris, for that comment. Yeah, some of you are mentioning missionary kids, and I know some of you, there's folks on here who have been part of Missionary Kid MK Safety Net, a very important organization that for some of you, if you don't know of it, should definitely look up. So thanks to all of you that I recognize who are here from that. And there is important research going on about mission kids in other settings. Some of you know that Holly Fletcher Berkeley is writing a book about missionary kids. She's not focused solely on abuse, but that's certainly a part of her project. So there's a lot of good work going on there. Yeah, I appreciate this. Jason, progressive denominations also sometimes have a been there, done that approach that opens them up in a different way. Talking to David. Okay, yeah, your point is well taken. I want to make sure everyone hears this. The progressive denominations do have better policies, but whether they're followed is another matter altogether. And that is part of what I was trying to say earlier. And I think, Jason, your addition there, that there's sort of a, we know what we're doing, we are doing just fine, and how that can really lead to a sort of sanguine ignoring of abuse in very specific cases. So that too is distressing. And of course, we see that in schools, and we see it in groups like the Boy Scouts and other organizations. You can have policies in place, and so people think because they're in place, everything's fine, or they don't have to be careful, and then bad things happen. So, oh, well, thank you for your kind words. The denomination question. I'm sorry. I'm realizing we're getting close to time, so I'm kind of skipping more carefully through.
There's a couple of more questions in the
Oh,
Q&A.
oh, thank you. Okay, sorry.
Do Protestant abusers sacramentalize abuse, as mine was?
Okay, yes. Thank you, Chris, for that question. So I think so Protestants don't really have a concept of sacramentalism exactly. I think there's two parallels. So the one that I mentioned is the use of the Bible. I mean, the Bible is the holy, holy book. That's the Eucharist of, for Baptists and for Protestants, if there's a comparison. And I think that use of the Bible, of Bible quoting, of kind of using God's will, is its own way of, it's kind of a parallel to that sacramentalism. But I have not seen the same kind of, like, no one has talked to me about being abused like in a baptismal font, or in something that would be closer to a kind of sacramental space for Baptists or for other evangelicals. I haven't heard that. Abuse in the pastor's study or his office is rampant. I definitely hear about that. But your question about the ways in which the religion gets intermingled and brought in as if this is somehow God's will or a part of a ritual in the same way, I think that's different from what I've heard from Catholics.
I've heard pretty close. Like for instance, altar boys who were abused in the sacristy,
Yes.
and half hour later they're receiving communion.
Oh, yes. In
So
the
that,
Catholic context,
yeah,
for sure. I think his question was, do I see it in the Protestant context in the same way? And that's
right.
sort of where I don't think I
Yes,
do.
yeah,
Yeah, thank you, Paula. I have been shocked at how many of my interviewees, my Catholic interviewees, have told me about that.
yep,
I mean, if I'm being raped with crucifixes, I mean,
right,
like
right.
I didn't just hear that once. And
Yes.
I'm I'm just stunned. I am
Mhm.
stunned. It's just the sickness of it. That's really what I don't understand. I definitely don't
I,
understand.
I do think, and even in the Protestant, settings, the scriptures are used in the aspect of it is God's will. I am loving you. I am God and I am loving you at this moment. And this is how God wants us to be together.
Yeah,
That is very, very common,
yeah,
amongst all who have been abused,
absolutely.
through scripture.
Right, right, right. No, absolutely. And, I think, in the evangelical world, maybe even a little bit differently or more than Catholic, there's a sense that God is speaking to me. God has shown me this. God has told me
Right.
this. And I've had a lot of survivors tell me that, a pastor would say that God told me that we were to be
Yes.
together. God
Yes.
told me that this is a holy relationship. It doesn't matter that you're married to someone else and I'm married to someone else. This is sacred. And I know Catholic priests have often, said and done similar
Hmm.
things. Um, multi-generational clergy sexual abuse. A question from Julie. I certainly have on the Catholic side. I have a little bit on the Protestant side. I think some of the, yes, on the mission field, yes, I have definitely encountered multi-generational clergy sexual abuse. And my hesitation in answering your question makes me realize I haven't thought about that as much as I should. So I think it's definitely there and needs more attention, but I don't have a lot to respond to on that. Um, oh, this is a wonderful one from Rhonda. Is anyone tracking the risk of abuse? Correlation, not attempting to prove causation, got it. But the risk between churches with women leaders versus men leaders. So yeah, I asked Marie Fortune a little bit about this, and I think you know, her research may now feel dated, but I think, certainly she had a pretty strong sense that there were lower rates of abuse in settings with women
Yeah.
leaders. Um, but interestingly, women have often also helped cover up abuse. So there's no surefire thing. That's true in the Catholic and the Protestant settings, right? I mean, I think women, and I'm really interested in women who have sort of been, I think from the outside, we'd see them as complicit with abuse, and maybe on the inside, they thought they were doing the right thing. How could that be? So I don't think there's any research out there on it. And frankly, in evangelical circles, there's really so few churches with women as sole pastors. There's some couples pastors, but there aren't too many with women. So we'd have to look more at Episcopal churches and other places where there are women clergy to answer that. But it's a great question.
Maria,
Um,
I think we're out of time.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Let me the last one is about any specific patterns regarding pastoral counseling. I am definitely looking at that. And yes, and a very, very important question. Thank you. Thank
Right.
you all for these great comments and questions.
Well, thank you, Marie. I can't thank you enough. That it has been so informative and helpful for us to know that you are moving forward with this research, and we hope that you'll reach out to us too, as well as us reaching out to you.
Thank you so
To
much.
help. So thank you so much. We
Thank
appreciate
you
your
all.
time. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance tonight and for your questions and comments. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.